The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of the Sterling estate, their light reflecting off champagne glasses and diamond jewelry worn by the city's most powerful elite. Victoria Sterling moved through her family's grand ballroom, like a queen surveying her kingdom, her emerald silk gown flowing behind her with each calculated step. At 28, she had inherited not just her family's billions, but also their reputation for sharp wit and sharper business decisions. Tonight's charity gala was supposed to raise funds for music education in underprivileged schools, though. Victoria suspected most guests were more interested in being seen than actually helping anyone. She paused near the ornate marble fireplace, accepting compliments from a tech mogul's wife about her latest acquisition of a Monet painting that the invisible man the evening had been proceeding exactly as planned until Victoria noticed him. James Carter, one of the estate's maintenance staff, was quietly refilling water pitchers at the service station near the back wall. She had seen him around the property for months, always working silently, never drawing attention to himself. There was something almost invisible about the way he moved through spaces, as if he belonged to the background rather than the foreground of life. James was 26, though his serious demeanor made him seem older. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his simple black uniform was pressed and clean. He had been working for the Sterling family for 8 months. Taking the job after his previous position at a hotel downtown had ended due to budget cuts. The pay was decent, and the work was honest, even if it meant being ignored by most of the people whose lives he helped maintain. The cruel. Inspiration Victoria's attention was drawn to James as he worked near the antique grand piano that dominated one corner of the ballroom. The instrument was a family heirloom, a beautiful Steinway that had been played by some of the world's most renowned musicians during parties in decades past. Tonight, it sat silent and closed, more decoration than instrument. A mischievous idea began forming in Victoria's mind. She had been entertaining her guests all evening with stories and witty observations, but the night felt like it needed something more memorable, something that would give people a story to tell at their own parties for weeks to come. She excused herself from her current conversation and made her way toward the piano, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Several guests noticed her movement and began following, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Victoria had a talent for creating moments that became the talk of social circles, and her friends had learned to pay attention when she got that particular gleam in her eye. The public. Challen James noticed the growing crowd but continued his work, assuming they were gathering for some announcement about the charity or perhaps a toast. He had learned to make himself even more invisible during social events, understanding that wealthy people preferred their service staff to be present but unnoticed. Victoria reached the piano and placed her manicured hand on its polished surface, immediately drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. The conversations around her began to quiet as people sensed that their hostess was about to provide entertainment. Her voice carried easily across the gathering crowd, pitched perfectly, to sound both casual and commanding. She had learned this skill in boardrooms and at society events. The art of making everyone feel included in an intimate moment while ensuring she remained the center of attention. The moment of truth, the challenge she issued was delivered with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, the expression she wore when she was about to enjoy someone else's discomfort. It was meant to be harmless fun, the kind of spontaneous moment that would give her guests something to laugh about over their after-dinner drinks. James heard every word clearly, and for a moment he stopped moving entirely. The water pitcher in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy as he processed what Victoria had just said. Around him he could hear the murmur of amused voices, the kind of anticipatory laughter that people make when they expect to witness someone's embarrassment. He had spent most of his life learning to be invisible, to do his job well without drawing attention to himself. But something about Victoria's challenge, delivered with such casual cruelty, stirred something deep inside him that he had kept carefully buried for years. The unexpected response, the guests were now openly staring at him, waiting to see how the maintenance worker would respond to their hostess's unexpected proposition. Some wore expressions of amused anticipation, others looked slightly uncomfortable but too polite to intervene. A few had already pulled out their phones, Sensing that whatever happened next might be worth recording, Victoria stood beside the piano with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, waiting for James to either decline with embarrassment or make a fool of himself trying. She expected him to stammer out some excuse and retreat back to his work, giving her guests a moment of harmless amusement at the expense of someone who would never be able to challenge her position. But James surprised everyone, including himself, by setting down the water pitcher and taking a step toward the piano. His movement was quiet but deliberate, and something in his posture made the laughter in the room fade slightly. He looked directly at Victoria for the first time since the challenge had been issued, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. The calm. Before the storm, his voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and clear, carrying none of the nervousness that everyone expected to hear. He did not sound like someone who was intimidated by the wealth and status surrounding him, nor like someone who was about to back down from an impossible challenge. The silence that followed his acceptance was different from the expectant, quiet that had preceded it. This silence carried weight, as if the entire room suddenly understood that something significant was about to happen, though no one could quite identify what that might be. Victoria felt a small flutter of uncertainty for the first time all evening, though she quickly pushed it aside. She had issued the challenge publicly, and now she was committed to seeing it through. She gestured toward the piano bench with theatrical grace, her smile still in place, though perhaps not quite as confident as it had been moments before. Approaching the instrument, James walked toward the piano with steady steps, his work uniform a stark contrast to the formal wear of everyone around him. The crowd parted slightly to give him room, and he could feel dozens of eyes following his movement. Some guests were already whispering to each other, speculating about what was about to unfold. He reached the bench and paused for just a moment, his hand resting on the polished wood. In that instant, memories flooded back to him, memories he had kept locked away for years. The old upright piano in his childhood home, his mother's gentle encouragement, the countless hours he had spent learning to coax music from damaged keys and broken pedals. The room held its collective breath as James lifted the piano's lid, revealing the pristine black and white keys beneath. The instrument was perfectly tuned and maintained, a far cry from the battered piano he had learned on, but his fingers recognized the familiar pattern immediately. The first touch Victoria watched from beside the piano, her expression shifting subtly as she realized that James was not showing any signs of the nervousness or incompetence she had expected. There was something about the way he positioned himself at the bench, the careful way he adjusted his posture, that suggested familiarity rather than fear. The first notes that emerged from the piano were tentative, as if James was testing both the instrument and his own long-dormant skills. But even those initial careful sounds carried a quality that made several guests stop their whispered conversations and pay closer attention as James's confidence grew. His playing became more assured, and the melody that filled the ballroom was nothing like what anyone had expected to hear from a maintenance worker who was supposed to be serving water to their tables. The transformation had begun, and nothing would ever be the same for either Victoria Sterling or James Carter. What had started as a moment of casual cruelty was about to become something that would challenge everything both of them thought they knew about talent, worth, and the assumptions people make about each other based on appearance and social position. The silence that followed James's acceptance of Victoria's challenge stretched like a taut wire across the Sterling Estate's grand ballroom. What had begun as casual entertainment for the wealthy elite was about to transform into something none of them could have predicted. The crystal chandeliers cast their warm glow over a scene that would soon become the talk of high society for months to come. James approached the magnificent Steinway grand piano with deliberate steps, its black maintenance uniform a stark contrast against the instrument's polished ebony surface. The guests formed a loose semicircle around the piano area, their champagne flutes forgotten in their hands as curiosity overtook their initial amusement. Many had already dismissed him as someone who would provide a few moments of awkward entertainment before retreating in embarrassment. The gathering storm, Victoria maintained her position near the piano, her emerald silk gown catching the light as she prepared to enjoy what she assumed would be James's inevitable failure. Her smile remained confident, though something in James's steady demeanor had begun to create a small knot of uncertainty in her stomach. She had expected nervousness, perhaps stammering excuses. But his calm acceptance of her challenge was not fitting the script she had written in her mind. The piano bench creaked slightly as James settled himself at the keyboard. He took a moment to adjust his posture, his hands resting lightly on his knees as he seemed to center himself. The crowd watched with varying degrees of anticipation, some already composing the amusing stories they would tell at their next social gathering about the maintenance worker who thought he could play piano. Professional eyes take notice. Thomas Mitchell, the distinguished music critic, had been drawn to the gathering more by social obligation than genuine interest. But something about the scene unfolding before him triggered his professional instincts. He moved closer, positioning himself where he could better observe James's technique and bearing. Years of evaluating performers had taught him to recognize certain qualities that went beyond mere bravado or wishful thinking. Rebecca Walsh stood near the marble fireplace, her journalist intuition telling her that this moment might develop into something worth documenting. She had covered countless society events where the entertainment was predictable and forgettable. But the energy in the room felt different tonight. The way conversations had completely stopped suggested that even the jaded social elite sensed something significant was about to happen. The first notes James lifted the piano's lid with practiced ease, revealing the pristine keyboard beneath. His movements were fluid and confident, lacking any of the hesitation that might be expected from someone unfamiliar with such a magnificent instrument. The guests noticed this unconscious familiarity, and several exchanged glances that conveyed growing curiosity mixed with skepticism. Without fanfare or announcement, James placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes were soft and contemplative, a gentle melody that seemed to test both the instrument's voice and the acoustics of the grand ballroom. The sound was pure and resonant, filling the space with warmth that contrasted sharply with the cool marble surfaces and formal atmosphere. The melody unfolds, the initial murmurs and whispered comments from the audience faded as James's playing grew more confident. His fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing assurance, and the simple melody began to evolve into something more complex and emotionally engaging. What had started as tentative exploration became purposeful musical expression. Victoria felt her smug anticipation beginning to waver as she realized that James was not struggling or embarrassing himself as she had expected. The music flowing from the piano was not the amateur fumbling she had anticipated, but something that demanded attention and respect. Her carefully maintained smile began to feel forced as she struggled to understand how her simple social game had taken such an unexpected turn. Chopin's masterpiece, the piece James had chosen, was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a composition that required not only technical proficiency but also sophisticated musical interpretation. His left hand established the flowing accompaniment, while his right hand sang the melody with expressive phrasing that revealed deep understanding of the composer's intentions. The music was hauntingly beautiful, and even the most musically ignorant guests could recognize that they were hearing something special. Dr. Margaret Kellaway, retired piano professor who attended these events primarily for their cultural connections, found herself leaning forward with professional interest. She had spent decades teaching advanced students and immediately recognized the qualities that separated genuine musicians from mere technicians. James's playing demonstrated musical maturity that typically took years of dedicated study to develop. Technical mastery revealed the technical demands of the Nocturne became more apparent as James progressed through the piece. His fingers navigated complex runs and delicate ornamentations with precision and grace, never sacrificing musical expression for mere display. The balance between melody and accompaniment was perfectly maintained, creating the illusion of multiple voices emerging. From the single instrument, young Catherine Montgomery, a recent graduate of an elite music conservatory, felt a mixture of admiration and professional jealousy as she listened. She had spent 4 years and considerable family resources developing skills that seemed to come naturally to this maintenance worker. Her training told her that what she was hearing required not just talent, but thousands of hours of dedicated practice. Emotional connection, the emotional depth of James's interpretation, began to affect the audience in ways that transcended social boundaries and preconceptions. The music spoke to universal human experiences of longing, beauty, and transcendence. That resonated regardless of the listener's background or circumstances. Several guests found themselves genuinely moved by the performance, temporarily forgetting the social dynamics that had led to this unexpected concert. James himself seemed transformed by the music, his usual reserved demeanor giving way to complete absorption in the artistic moment. His body moved naturally with the musical phrases, leaning into climaxes and pulling back during intimate passages. It was clear that he was not simply playing memorized notes, but actively engaging with the composition as a living, breathing work of art. Perfect acoustics, the ballroom's acoustics. Designed for conversation and social interaction, proved surprisingly well-suited for piano music. The high ceilings and hard surfaces created a resonant environment that allowed James's playing to fill every corner of the space. Even guests standing near the far walls could hear every nuance of his interpretation. With perfect clarity, Victoria found herself in the uncomfortable position of having completely misjudged both James and the situation she had created. What was supposed to be a moment of light entertainment at someone else's expense had evolved into a serious artistic performance that commanded genuine respect. She could feel the attention in the room shifting away from her role as hostess and toward James as the evening's most compelling figure. Technical brilliance, the nocturne's most technically demanding passage, arrived in the middle section, where Chopin had written elaborate ornamentation that required precise fingerwork and careful timing. James navigated these challenges with apparent ease, his years of private practice evident in every perfectly executed trill and gracefully shaped phrase. The music seemed to flow effortlessly from his hands, though anyone with musical knowledge could appreciate the skill required to make such difficulty appear simple. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, James's playing became even more expressive and personal. The final section of the nocturne allowed for considerable interpretive freedom, and he took advantage of this opportunity to create moments of stunning beauty through subtle timing and dynamic control. The music seemed to speak directly to each listener's heart, creating an intimate connection that was remarkable in such a formal social setting. The stunning finale, the final notes of the nocturne, faded into silence, and James allowed his hands to rest on the keyboard for a moment before lifting them away. The ballroom remained completely quiet, as if the audience needed time to process what they had just experienced. The silence was not awkward or uncomfortable, but rather filled with the kind of reverence that follows truly exceptional artistic performance. Then the applause began, starting with a few individuals and quickly building into sustained, enthusiastic approval that filled the grand ballroom. The guests who had gathered expecting to witness social embarrassment instead found themselves applauding genuine artistry that had moved and impressed them despite their initial prejudices. The aftermath, Victoria joined the applause automatically, but her mind was racing as she tried to comprehend how completely her expectations had been overturned. The maintenance worker she had sought to humiliate had instead delivered a performance that would be remembered long after her carefully planned charity gala had been forgotten. The power dynamic in her own home had shifted dramatically, and she was no longer controlling the evening's narrative. Thomas Mitchell was among the first to approach James after the applause subsided, his critical instincts fully engaged by what he had witnessed. Years of evaluating professional musicians had taught him to recognize exceptional talent, and James's performance had displayed qualities that many conservatory graduates never achieved. Rebecca Walsh quickly followed, her journalist's nose detecting a story that would transcend the usual society page coverage. A gifted musician working as maintenance staff, while harboring dreams of artistic recognition, was exactly the kind of human interest narrative that would resonate far beyond the wealthy. Social circles she typically covered, new connections other. Guests began gathering around James, their earlier dismissive attitudes completely transformed by his unexpected demonstration of remarkable ability. The invisible man who had served their drinks had suddenly become the most interesting person in the room, and everyone wanted to understand how such talent had remained hidden in plain sight. The evening's carefully planned schedule seemed suddenly irrelevant as spontaneous conversations about music, talent, and opportunity began sprouting throughout the ballroom. James found himself at the center of attention that was both gratifying and overwhelming. Having spent years deliberately avoiding notice from the wealthy families he served, Victoria F. watched from the sidelines as her role as evening's hostess was gradually superseded by James's emergence as its most compelling figure. The social dynamics she had understood and controlled her entire life had been completely disrupted by a single musical performance that revealed the depth of her own assumptions and prejudices. The evening's true success, the charity auction that was supposed to follow, felt almost anticlimactic after James's unexpected concert. Though the evening raised more money than anticipated, as guests seemed inspired by the reminder that extraordinary talent could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, many made sure to speak with James personally, some offering business cards and hints about potential opportunities. The maintenance worker, who had begun the evening as invisible staff, would leave it as someone whose name and story would be remembered and discussed throughout the city's social networks. Victoria found herself facing an uncomfortable truth. Her attempt to create entertainment at James's expense had backfired completely, revealing more about her own character than his limitations, while simultaneously providing him with a platform to demonstrate abilities that would change the trajectory of his life in ways none of them could yet imagine. The morning after the charity gala dawned gray and drizzling, matching Victoria Sterling's mood as she sat in her private study overlooking the estate's manicured gardens. The events of the previous evening played on repeat in her mind, each memory more uncomfortable than the last. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by the image of James Carter at the piano and the way his music had transformed not just the atmosphere in the ballroom, but something fundamental within herself. The society pages had already begun. Their coverage and Victoria's phone buzzed constantly with notifications from various social media platforms. Rebecca Walsh's article in the Metropolitan Daily had been published online at dawn, and the response was overwhelming. The headline read, "Hidden Genius Shines at Sterling Estate Gala," and while the piece praised James's extraordinary talent, it also subtly questioned the circumstances that had led to his performance. Victoria scrolled through the comments beneath the article, her stomach tightening with each critical observation. Many readers had picked up on the underlying dynamics of the evening, recognizing that James had been put in an uncomfortable position for the entertainment of wealthy guests. The narrative emerging in public discourse was not flattering to her or her social circle. Meanwhile, across town in his modest apartment above Romano's Delicatessen, James Carter was experiencing his own form of morning-after reflection. His small living space, furnished with second-hand pieces and dominated by an old upright piano his mother had bought years ago, felt both familiar and suddenly limiting. The contrast between his humble surroundings and the opulent ballroom where he had performed the night before was stark and somehow significant. His phone had been ringing since 6 in the morning. Thomas Mitchell had called 3 times each, message more enthusiastic than the last. Rebecca Walsh had left a voicemail requesting a follow-up interview. Most surprisingly, the Sterling Estates personnel office had called to schedule a meeting about his employment status, though they had been deliberately vague about the purpose. James's mother, Helen Carter, bustled around the small kitchen preparing breakfast with barely contained excitement. She had always believed in her son's musical abilities, even when financial circumstances had forced them to abandon formal lessons. Seeing him receive recognition for talents she had never doubted filled her with a pride that was almost overwhelming. "Whole neighborhood is talking about you," Helen said, sliding scrambled eggs onto a plate. "Mrs. Rodriguez from downstairs saw the video online. She said you looked like you belonged on a concert stage, not cleaning up after rich folks." James accepted the plate gratefully, though his appetite was minimal. The attention felt surreal and somewhat uncomfortable. He'd spent years deliberately avoiding notice, perfecting the art of moving through spaces without drawing attention to himself. Suddenly finding himself at the center of public interest was disorienting. "Keep thinking about her face," James admitted, referring to Victoria's expression during his performance. She looked so surprised, like she couldn't understand what was happening. Helen sat across from her son with her own breakfast, her expression thoughtful. Maybe that's exactly what she needed. Some people go their whole lives without having their assumptions challenged. Could be the best thing that ever happened to her? At the Sterling estate, Victoria was having her own uncomfortable revelations. She had always prided herself on being a good judge of character in situations. But the previous evening had revealed blind spots in her perception that were difficult to acknowledge. How many other people had she dismissed or overlooked based on their social position or occupation? Her father, Robert Sterling, appeared in the doorway of her study carrying 2 cups of coffee. At 68, he retained the sharp intelligence and measured demeanor that had built the family fortune. But his relationship with his daughter had always been complicated by his high expectations and her strong will. "Rough night?" he asked. Settling into the leather chair across from her desk, Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully. "I made a mistake, Dad. A big one." Robert had already read Rebecca Walsh's article and several of the social media responses. His business instincts told him that this situation required careful handling to avoid lasting damage to the family's reputation and his daughter's standing in their social circle. "The young man played beautifully," Robert said carefully. "But I understand there were some uncomfortable circumstances surrounding his performance." Victoria nodded miserably. "I thought it would be funny. Just a harmless little challenge that would give everyone something to laugh about. I never imagined he could actually play, let alone like that. And now I look like exactly what I am. A privileged woman who thought it was entertaining to put someone in an impossible situation for her own amusement." Victoria's voice carried a weight of self-recognition that was new and unwelcome. Robert studied his daughter's expression, recognizing genuine remorse rather than mere social embarrassment. "What do you plan to do about it?" That question would occupy Victoria's thoughts for the next several days. Her first instinct was to reach out to James directly, but she understood that any approach needed to be carefully considered. A thoughtless apology might seem as condescending as her original challenge had been. James, meanwhile, was discovering that his life had changed in ways both welcome and challenging. Thomas Mitchell had introduced him to Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a renowned piano instructor who worked with advanced students preparing for professional careers. After hearing recordings of his performance, she had offered to provide lessons at dramatically reduced rates. "You have extraordinary natural ability," Dr. Hoffman told him during their first meeting, "but there are technical aspects and repertoire knowledge that could benefit from formal instruction. If you're serious about pursuing music professionally, I'd like to help." The offer was tempting and terrifying in equal measure. James had dreamed of serious musical study for years, but had accepted that such opportunities were beyond his financial reach. Now, suddenly, doors were opening that he had thought were permanently closed. Several nonprofit organizations focused on music education had also contacted James. They were interested in having him participate in outreach programs that would demonstrate how musical talent could emerge from unexpected circumstances. These opportunities offered modest compensation and the chance to share his love of music with young people facing similar economic challenges. Most intriguingly, the Sterling estate had officially offered him a position as special events coordinator. Recognizing that his story and musical abilities could be valuable assets for future fundraising activities, the salary was significantly higher than his maintenance position, and the work would allow him to use his musical background professionally. Victoria learned about these developments through her social network, each piece of news creating a complex mixture of emotions. She felt genuine happiness about James's improving circumstances, but also guilt about her role in the events that had led to his recognition. Most unexpectedly, she found herself curious about who James Carter really was beyond their brief interaction. 2 weeks after the gala, Victoria made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than sending another formal request for a meeting, through estate management, she decided to seek him out in a more natural setting. She had learned that James often spent his lunch breaks at Riverside Park, a public space near downtown where he could practice on an old piano in the community. She arrived at the park on a Tuesday afternoon, feeling uncharacteristically nervous about a social interaction. Victoria Sterling had never doubted her ability to navigate any social situation with grace and confidence. But approaching James required a humility she was still learning to access. She found him in the community center's main room, seated at a well-worn upright piano that had seen better days. Several children were gathered around, watching with fascination as he played simple melodies and encouraged them to try playing themselves. The scene was so different from the formal ballroom setting of their first encounter that Victoria paused in the doorway. Observing this more authentic version of the man she had tried to embarrass, James noticed her presence immediately, but continued, working with the children for several more minutes before approaching her. His manner was polite but reserved, clearly uncertain about her intentions in seeking him out. "Miss Sterling," he said formally, "this is unexpected. Please call me Victoria. And yes, I suppose it is unexpected. I was hoping we could talk." They walked to a quiet corner of the community center, where mismatched chairs surrounded a small table that had been donated by a local business. The setting was humble compared to the Sterling estate, but somehow more conducive to honest conversation. "Owe you an apology," Victoria began, then stopped herself. "Actually, that's not quite right. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement that what I did was wrong, regardless of how it turned out." James studied her expression, looking for signs of insincerity or self-serving motivation. He had learned to be cautious around wealthy people, understanding that their interest in him was often temporary and conditional. "You don't owe me anything," he said carefully. "I'm grateful for the opportunities that came from it, but that doesn't make what I did acceptable. I put you in an impossible situation for my own entertainment, and the fact that you handled it brilliantly doesn't excuse my behavior." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, touching on topics that went far beyond the gala incident. Victoria found herself genuinely interested in James's thoughts about music, social inequality, and the assumptions people made about each other based on appearance and circumstances. His insights were thoughtful and well-articulated, challenging her preconceptions about people from different economic backgrounds. James, despite his initial wariness, began to recognize something authentic in Victoria's manner that was different from the privileged persona she had displayed at the gala. Her questions seemed genuinely curious rather than condescending, and her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes suggested capacity for growth that he had not expected as their regular coffee meetings became a pattern over the following weeks. Both Victoria and James discovered that their connection transcended the circumstances of their first encounter. Victoria's organizational skills and access to resources complemented James's understanding of the challenges faced by aspiring musicians without financial advantages. Together, they began developing ideas for programs that could provide real opportunities rather than mere charity. The turning point in their relationship came when Victoria attended one of James's performances at a local nursing home, where he played for residents who had limited access to live music. Watching him interact with elderly listeners who were genuinely moved by his playing, she began to understand the difference between music as social entertainment and music as genuine artistic expression. After the performance, as they walked through the nursing home's garden, Victoria made an offer that surprised them both. "I want to establish a music scholarship program," she said. "Not just another charitable tax write-off, but something that really makes a difference. I need someone who understands the challenges talented musicians face when they don't have financial resources. I need someone who knows what real barriers look like, not just theoretical ones." James stopped walking, turning to study her expression in the fading afternoon light. "You're asking me to help design this program? I'm asking you to partner with me. Your experiences and insights are essential if we're going to create something meaningful rather than just symbolic." Working together on the scholarship project revealed depths of compatibility between Victoria and James that neither had expected. Their different backgrounds provided complementary perspectives that strengthened their planning and execution. Victoria's connections and resources, combined with James's understanding of practical needs and challenges, created a program that was both well-funded and genuinely useful. As the scholarship program developed from concept to reality, a professional partnership gradually evolved into something more personal. The woman who had once sought to humiliate a maintenance worker for entertainment had learned to question her assumptions and use her privilege constructively. The man she had tried to embarrass had found his voice and discovered, opportunities he had never imagined possible. Their relationship faced skepticism from both their social circles, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared purpose, and the gradual recognition that their initial encounter, however problematic, had led both of them toward becoming better versions of themselves. The scholarship program they created together would go on to support dozens of talented, young musicians from working-class backgrounds, providing not just financial assistance, but mentorship and performance opportunities. It became Victoria's most meaningful philanthropic achievement, and James's entry into a world where his musical talents could serve a purpose beyond personal expression. Their story had transformed from a tale of social cruelty into one of genuine partnership and personal growth, proving that understanding between people from different worlds was possible. When approached with authentic openness and willingness to change,